town that they lived in. So what we're going to do, for those of you who have not been on one of these before, there is a chat button at the bottom. If you would like to ask a question, just write it out for me, and I will, if appropriate, we'll read it out. I'll try to get to all of them. I tend not to talk about particular current political questions, because that is not the kind of journal that the University Bookman is. So that you could do with him in a different form, perhaps. But if you have other kinds of questions, happy to read them out. And we'll be ending. We'll give Cecilia in a minute at the end, just so she can tell you a little bit more about the Russell Kirk Center and how to stay in contact more with us. So now I think, David, I'm going to hit it off with a couple of questions. We wanted to talk to you a little bit in the context of you being a historian, and a respected one, and someone who grew up in this town and was collecting information to try and build a memoir or a history, not only of yourself, but of the people who live there. And as someone from a family that grew up somewhat close, Niagara Falls, which had something similar of immigrants coming to the country and working in very hard jobs in specific ethnic groups. I'm not sure I would look or where I would be able to look for the resources or historical data that would show me what they were doing, other than what my family has. So maybe give a little bit of a sense of where this was coming from, and how did you go out and find something outside your family that you might have had on your own?
Well, something, there's a thing called the internet. and I wrote this in a year or so where, all the libraries were shut down, but the internet is the biggest library of all. And one specific site was invaluable. All the institutions and all the foundations and all the public libraries get grant upon grant. But out there, also in upstate New York, is a fellow who has put, 50 million pages of New York State newspapers online without a dime of public money, just getting reels of microfilm and putting them in and OCR. And when you go back to the newspapers, the small town newspapers of yesteryear. Now, I wouldn't have had the resources if I had grown up in Queens or Detroit or somewhere like that. But in a small town back then, and particularly with the paper that served me in Amsterdam, New York, the Amsterdam Recorder, they would print all sorts of things, so that when my mother had like a little sorority party in high school, that would be reported, and who came from out of town to the wakes, who the pallbearers were, that level of detail, and all preserved there on microfilm and now on the internet and searchable in one way or another, if the newspaper actually spelled all the ethnic names right, which they did not always do that correctly. So sometimes you found something further down the road and under a vastly different spelling.
Right. And as we're putting this information together about Amsterdam, and in both its geography and roughly who was living who or where, that was a little bit predating you, so you're kind of putting that together, and then after your arrival on the scene, what the city looks for or looks like. What is, as you're thinking about this, as you're going through that analysis, because and I'd like to hear a little bit about your perception of the town as coherent together. They were all from, or many from, similar places in Europe, and they were replicating that in an America that's giving them different kinds of jobs, then sending them off to the war, having them come back, and then who knows what. What is striking you as the nature of that community in that town?
It really is. It's a mill town. The manufacturing base is carpets, two big carpet mills then, which are going to start saying adios to Amsterdam in the mid
Right.
1950s and continuing on until thousands and thousands of jobs leave, and it leaves you with a town which is seriously depressed and is depressed to this day.
Mhm.
And it was actually, it still is an immigrant town. It's immigrant in a different way now, with a large Hispanic population. Maybe a quarter of the town is Hispanic. Back then, as I was growing up, the town was 75% Catholic, with the biggest ethnic groups being Polish and Italian, with some Irish people left over from the building of the Erie Canal,
Right.
and a fairly large contingent of Lithuanians, and then after World War II, the displaced persons, Ukrainians, and even a lot of the people who worked in, oh, say, the better or more skilled jobs in the carpet mills were immigrants from the British Isles. So
Mhm.
you had a mix of Eastern, Western, and Southern Europeans all in town, and all contributing to the workforce and the culture. But what you're talking about coming from specific places is, in the case of the Poles in town, and particularly my relatives, they come from two villages in southern Poland, in the Austrian Habsburg ruled portion of the country before World War I. Extremely poor part of Europe. It's been called the poorest part of Europe. 50,000 people a year
Mhm.
supposedly starved to death there. Millions and millions left for the New World, first for Brazil of all places, and
Mhm.
then for America per se, the United States. And they come from these two towns. They settle in Amsterdam, and then you see the same thing happening with the Italians in town. The people on the West End from one village in southern Italy, the people on the south side from another village in southern Italy. And so the immigrant communities in these towns are very tight knit, not only because of commonalities of language and religion and maybe what mill they work in, et cetera, in the neighborhood they live in, but because their families knew each other from the old country and were related in the old country and are even more related in the new country. And I think this is a commonality for any immigrant group and any time frame, where one guy comes over to the new land, and then he brings over maybe his parents or his brother, and then his sisters and his cousins, whom he numbers by the dozens, as Gilbert and Sullivan used to say. And before you know it, you've got an entirely new situation in the new world. And there's another immigrant experience I talk about in the book, which is the immigrant experience within America. That that is not only about the great migration of the blacks from the south to the north around World War I. It's also internally, as economics shift. I mean, it goes back as far as the great migration from New England all the way to the West Coast, the covered wagons and all that. But we also saw that in
Mhm.
my family, when a bunch of people we were very close to, very close relatives, people we would see every week,
Mhm.
and they got up and they saw the opportunities in Arizona and they took them. And when they took them, they took a large part of our family and our sense of belonging and
Mhm.
our
A
heart
different
with
part.
them.
Right.
And this happens. One of the things we do not talk about the immigrant experience is the people that are left behind.
Mhm.
And sometimes people can't go and seize these economic opportunities. In my case, my grandmother was seriously mentally ill. We couldn't take her along across, to a new
Right.
part of the continent, and we could not leave her either. So we
Mhm.
we were kind of stuck as hard times came,
Right.
and there are millions of people like that, and they feel a sense of loss when other people go on to take new opportunities. Not that there's anything wrong with that, Not that there's anything wrong with that at all, because that's what you have to do. It's life, and
Right.
it's not all sunshine and roses.
Right, right. Yeah, that what you just said touches base on a lot of recent work, including Gracie Olmstead's book that came out about more generically about being uprooted. And my own family is story is not so much different from the example you gave, which is they grew up in West Virginia. They didn't want to be, five brothers did not want to become coal miners. One goes to Arizona, one goes to become a gangster in Chicago. The other two go down south. Then my grandmother goes to Niagara Falls with someone else, who then becomes uh, a um, a Union Carbide worker in their factory. And they left back some people in their mine town, but they wanted to go to try and find another opportunity. Uh, but to focus a little bit on your folks your family who had to stay in that town, uh, there is a debate among some right wingers, some of whom say, well, if the town is going down, you need to leave. You shouldn't stay at all. So your community doesn't count as much. Your history doesn't count as much. The free market is the free market, and you should just go follow them. Now, I agree with what you just said, which is it's not a bad idea to go for an opportunity. The life does change, but there is something in those towns, and you can't just say, well, you should forget the town. You shouldn't ask the government for help. It shouldn't be maintained. Uh, in your historical look at that town, um, do you see that kind of tension occurring? That people were leaving, or the governor or government of New York says, no, we're not putting any more money into this. We're going to put you up a road to get you away from the town and you don't have to go through it, as opposed to saying, no, 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 communities should be protected, at least as long as people can not leave at the very least.
I wouldn't do it by governmental action. And one of the things which pops into the book at the end of the book, and the book covers from my birth and before my birth up to the day I leave for college. And in my high school years, that was the Great Society. And the Great Society determined that it was going to make everything great. And it really didn't. And it wrecked an awful lot of towns. In Amsterdam, it ended up destroying hundreds and hundreds of buildings in the business section. You take a look at the website for the city right now, and every city is going to tell you how great they are and things are great. And the website in Amsterdam tells you how it was wrecked, and leaving Amsterdam was a place you just drove through now, and there was just nothing to do anymore. And it's Lyndon Johnson, his hero was FDR. And FDR gave every downtown a new post office. And FDR's dream was to give every post office a new downtown. And those downtowns weren't always wonderful. But in what you were talking about the families and keeping them together, and should people stay? Well, the people who stayed in Amsterdam did have a benefit of which you can't put a price tag on. They still had the remnants of that traditional society, of the families which were so close together, of the neighborhoods which were so close together. The folks from Amsterdam who, because the carpet mills moved out, were scattered to the wind, to Georgia, to Arizona, to Florida, to wherever. And did they move into intact neighborhoods, or maybe just into new tract houses and boom towns and where anyone knew anyone else? And I would say the answer was no, not so much. But even with harsh economic times in Amsterdam, look, so the money's not there, the jobs aren't there. You're subsiding for a while on unemployment insurance and surplus food given out by the federal government at the armory down on the south side. But you're also relying on the fact that your mother's aunt and uncle are your landlords. And so you don't have to worry that much about the rent.
Mhm.
And the people you've known and your family has known for a very long time run the meat market around the corner. And you may not be able to pay them right away, but they trust you to pay eventually. And so you subsist on the kindness, not of strangers, but the kindness of family and neighbors in a world that does not exist anymore. You know, the one of the subtitles of the book, or part of it, is A Vanished World. And that's, you know, it's the story in the book. I'm maybe the fourth character in the book. There's the city, there's my family, there's the times in which I lived, in which my ancestors lived.
Mhm. And in your lifetime, as you're growing up post end of World War II, where some people in that town, well, a lot of people in that town were sent over, and not everyone came back. Uh, do you sense that, or did you sense that you have this great section in the book about a lot of people remember happy songs, or it's sort of, but you should think about these poignant songs. So you should find them on YouTube and find it, because that's not the only way to perceive the war. What do you recall your recollection being in that time period? Were people happy to be back and happy to be making money? Were they, this is a crazy country because they just sent us all over to kill thousands of people. I'm glad to be back, but we're still shattered. What's the the memories that you have of
Well, as
reconstructing that
hard
time?
as the 50s, the late 50s were, and then
Mhm.
things sort of settled into a survival mode and a sort of steady downward drift of the town, although we eventually righted our own finances in the family.
Right.
But the community was still going down. You knew there was no no real future there. But in terms of being post-war, the it was as if the war was almost still going on,
Mm.
and not in terms of sacrifice or hearing about casualty reports or rationing or anything like that, but you knew everyone, you know, was like a veteran, or they had stories to tell about working in the defense plants, and the historical references on television and in the world itself were so great. You know, look
Right.
who was going to end up running for president in 1960 to succeed the commander of Allied forces in World War in Europe in the Second World War. You've got three veterans: you Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon. So it's absolutely completely surrounding you. And one of the stories I tell in the book is one day my mother calls me into the kitchen, and I'm in my 30s, and she says, I have something to tell you. And she says, I was married before I married your father. And it's like, oh, and what's up with that? Were they divorced? Was it a scandal of some
Right.
sort? Did he run off? And it was none of the above. What it was is he had also been in the service in World War II, was serving with a bombing squadron, bombed Germany many times in very dangerous missions, and was riding in a truck. March 1945 in England, it overturned and he was killed. And
Mm.
that was it. No scandal at all, but people kind of held things in. They didn't wear every complaint on their sleeve about their life. And it kept even many basic things like that private. You know, there were certain, you know, hints as to, you know, that I should have picked up on. I mean, I still have her wedding portrait of her in her wedding dress. It's not white. It's a
Oh,
powder blue, and
right.
I just thought it was bad photography.
Right, 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 right. Yeah, not in those days. It would be white also. Uh, and so when during that period, you then, as you said, things start to slide downward, say 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. Before we get to that period, I want to ask you a couple questions about that. But and I did read some of your examples about court trials, party politics, running for office, or switching parties. And uh, I'm curious as to how these relatively new groups who did not come from a voting democracy start to understand American politics. The couple of stories you have in there are funny, which is they switch politics and they win the trial, or they sort of go back and forth. That shows that they use it at some of them anyway. Use that politics as just a way to get forward. But what in either doing your own research or your life experience, how does that interaction with people who didn't really have that experience when they were over in Europe are now, or their children, leaning into how they're supposed to operate in a town that they can run for office, they can talk to the governor, whatever they needed to do?
I think even the old timers, and by the old timers, I mean, people who grew up around the time of World War I. They may not have been immigrants themselves. Some of them were, but they caught on to the old the old democracy thing and the old party politics very much so. The Italians in town may have been Republicans. The Poles were extremely democratic. So much so that they did not elect an alderman in the ward I was in from 1920 until 1985, 65 years. And it took a hell of a breakthrough to make that alderman occur in 1985. That was me. And, I mean, the saying was they would not vote for, if Jesus Christ himself was running as a Republican in that ward, they would not vote for him.
Huh.
And there was, there wasn't ethnic tension about it. That the Americans, so to speak, the Western Europeans, the Protestants, the up county people, the farmers, those were the Republicans of the world. And and us folks who relied on in many cases on one of the big issues at that time. Now, Jack Kennedy, talk about politics. Jack Kennedy comes into our town in 1960 to campaign for president. And he's speaking in a big parking lot in downtown Amsterdam. And he starts off with the old Kennedy charm. He says to people, I'm glad that so many of you people came here today to see me on your lunch hour. I'm here on my lunch hour too. And then he goes on to talk about what's important to the town. And one of the big issues is he's talking about being able to convert from a failed mill town into high tech back then, because that is what's happening in the mill towns, the decaying mill towns around New England. I mean, this industrial decay is happening not just in Amsterdam, New York, or upstate New York, but it probably started, I like to say that the first rust appeared in the Rust Belt in Amsterdam, New York, which may or may not be true, but it's true enough. and it hurt enough, but probably started in New England. But he's talking about increasing the minimum wage, and he's talking about increasing the amount of weeks you can get unemployment insurance. And that would be an issue that would redound to us. And it took a long time for me to realize that increasing that minimum wage really did nothing. I mean, now we talk about how much, and it is certainly true, how it will cost jobs, but it just fuels inflation. And when you fuel inflation, what do? You deplete the savings of the people who have gone without. The Polish people back then were an incredibly frugal people. And my boyhood home was eventually torn down for a rather large bank, which was called the Polish Bank. The depositors were Polish, and legend had it there was just an immense amount of money which was socked away in there from those folks. And when you would go in to get your money out of that bank, you might take $5 out or something, and the clerk, the teller on the other side of the bars would just look at you with this pained look, like, why are you acting so recklessly? And they almost like call in the vice president to try to talk you out of it. But what I'm getting at is that every dollar in inflation and inflation is fueled so much by things like increasing minimum wage rates, because then nobody wants to be minimum anymore. Okay, if that rate you were at is now minimum, well, I'm not a minimum
I'm
guy.
gonna go up,
Okay,
right.
and so that every dollar is a dollar stolen from the savings of people who went without, to sock that money away
Right,
for a
right.
rainy day, to provide for themselves.
Right, right. And was it the case that at the time, people like JFK or others are making those promises, no one realizes that as an economic matter? That sounds good to them. They work hard. Why not pay them more, or force them to pay their own? Is that, and then it only becomes later obvious that as an economic matter, all the money you have hidden in the bank, or yet your parents do, that's not a great idea.
Yeah, Jack Kennedy wasn't that bad on economics, but I mean, he was pushing that, and he was pushing the standard Democratic and Liberal Party line on that. So, yeah.
And so, what was your argument to get elected in 1980? How'd you do it?
I ran against everyone. I ran against everyone. The Republican ward chairman actually had to sign up for my Democratic opponent. The Republican mayor was against me. I mean, really. And but what I did was I was a reformer. I was a
Right.
reformer. I'm saying, look, we didn't go by the Constitution. That would have been a little highfalutin talk. But I would go by the city charter says this. It's written here. You go by this. And also what I ran against was, I guess, I don't think that was the word then, but crony capitalism, where you had certain industrial development agencies, and
Right.
you saw the money was being passed out to people who had the connections. And it was not really adding much to economic development at all, except it was adding to some people's economic development.
Right.
And if you tell people the truth, and if they believe you mean it, I mean, they'll trust you. I put out my first flyer telling people I was running, and I said, I'm not going to promise you I'm not going to raise taxes, because I don't know, what portion of Main Street is going to fall into the river or anything. But I could tell you, I know how hard you people work for this money.
Right.
And I'm not going to take it away from you. And I never did vote. I never did raise taxes.
And so those things, and I think I understand a little bit of this, but given the year you're talking about, and looking back at the 60s and 70s and what had happened to towns like that, are you putting it in your head that even with good intentions, and even if not with crony capitalism, that's one cause of why the town looks like this? It's not all free market economics.
No,
Okay.
it's such a. There are so many reasons why, specifically Amsterdam went downhill. First off, the original reason why it's there, it no longer held any advantage. It was on a creek.
Yeah.
Okay, so the first mill is on water power. And then, you get into coal and electricity and all that. And all of a sudden being on a creek isn't, what it used to be. And then they build an Erie Canal. And then that helps for a while. And then all of a sudden they put railroads in. And then everybody around the country's got railroads. And then they build throughways. And Eisenhower puts in the interstate highway system. So the advantages of cheap power or location or infrastructure in terms of transportation are suddenly gone. And then you have the tax and regulatory structure of New York and the Northeast. And then you have all up and down the Northeast, what protected the industries, protection, the tariffs, we thought that issue was gone. And then it came back 4 years ago. But, the importation of cheaper foreign carpets, or to the north of us. Well, one of the things I talk about in the book is we're very close to a place called Fulton County, which was the home of Richard Russello, very successful novelist. And he talks about how things were going down there. That economy was based on gloves. Okay, try and buy a American-made pair of gloves anymore, or the shoes,
Right.
which dominated the Binghamton area, shoe manufacturing, or New England. Okay, so all of those things were very deleterious to Amsterdam.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Got it. Okay. And before I move on to a couple of other questions, someone of the audience has a question that challenges a little bit what you had said, which is that when we were talking about how length of a time did the World War II legacy, wasn't quite sure that LBJ fits into that category as a veteran.
Well, he had the Silver Star to prove it, and it was pinned on his lapel by Douglas MacArthur. So there. But the gentleman is essentially correct. Lyndon Johnson entered the war. He was, I think, the first member of Congress to enlist, December 8th, 1941. And before the war, he was saying, now, if I'm going to send you boys, your boys into war, I'm going to go into the mud and the blood myself. And well, he had no intention of doing that at all.
Right.
But he knew, but he was getting the pressure after a while that he had to enlist. He did enlist. He went into the South Pacific, just like Kennedy and Nixon, and flew on one combat mission, which actually I think they dumped their bombs before they got there. Okay. And he was essentially a passenger, and he got that big medal for it. And then his pal, Sam Rayburn, put the word into FDR that any congressman should return to duty in Congress or resign their seat. So at that point, LBJ thought it was safe to leave the South Pacific and return to his higher calling.
Got it. So just enough to say it over and over again.
Just enough. Just
get
enough.
It back. Got it. And so for the another question I wanted to go through to you, and you referenced it a little bit, is one could look at the United States and its towns and neighborhoods, as you mentioned, that can still be filled with these very tight immigrant communities, just not Poles and not Italians or others, but new ones. And those books haven't yet been written, or in a way that have been talking about this story. And so, have you come up as you were going through this book and looking at those decades, say, well, this isn't going to happen just to us. This is an American character issue. They much prefer people to wander around, live in a suburb without an ethnic community, that you just land with a bunch of people. That's just what America does, because we go looking for the money, or we go looking for the new job or bigger house or whatever. Is that just something that America does? And
you kind of have starter neighborhoods, you have starter homes and you have starter neighborhoods, and when there's a language barrier, I remember seeing ads in those old newspapers, and it would say it was an ad for a baker shop, and it would be say, "Oh, we want to hire a Lithuanian clerk." Racism? No, because all your customers are Lithuanians, and you want to have someone there who could speak Lithuanian. So it's how you have to settle in to the a new land. And if I were moving to France, shall we say, I would probably end up hanging out with a disproportionate amount of Americans. It's simply human nature. But I have had people saying to me, I felt the same way about my experience growing up. I was an Italian in Queens, or I actually had a fellow who was very high church Episcopalian from New Jersey telling me the same thing, which floored me. I'm not sure how true that was, but I'll take it.
That's funny. Well, in my growing up or going into college, and after that, I knew I had to drop my Brooklyn Italian accent because people thought that meant I was stupid. And so I would need to present myself in a way that didn't look like I came from Brooklyn or was Italian, because they would, write you off and you had to adjust yourself. And I took that to mean over time is that, well, that's what America does. They want you to become, come into the free market, but you got to do it in a particular way. And so my vague view is, not that I know these communities, is that that will happen to every immigrant community because that is largely what America does.
I hope it does, actually.
Yeah,
I hope it does. And one of the stories in the book, or one of the things I recount is that why, for example, so like you're like Mr. Polish, okay? So can you speak Polish? No. And the reason is because my parents didn't want me to speak Polish.
Right.
And I think that they and the generation before them simply wanted their children to become Americans. I mean, they wanted to keep as much of their culture as they could, but there was a great desire for us to make that jump into that. And of course, there was a more nefarious reason for that, which is not a question of my paranoia or anything, because I was flat out told it by my parents. They wanted to talk behind my back. They didn't want me to know everything that was going on. And I've heard this story from other folks too.
Can I say something?
That's great.
May I speak on this issue? Are
Sure.
you okay with hearing? I live in the Upper Peninsula. My dad and Russell Kirk were best of friends in East Lansing, where I grew up. But the Upper Peninsula speaks to what you're saying, starting out with mining and forestry. And we attracted Italian miners. We attracted Cornish from England because the era they came was when things weren't so good in Europe. And they took, and then the Finns took over as the labor people.
Yes, very actually sort of radical people.
There was definitely levels of intelligence about mining even. And then foresters took on, and commercial fishing. And our land looks very much like the Scandinavian countries. So they were very much attracted. The only disappointment were any who wanted to farm, because we don't have good. We do potato growing up here, I guess now, but we really don't have good. But truly, that's the attraction for different nationalities. And there's an awful lot of blending and diversity here now, but we still, when I moved up here, I could not get over the number of bars in the smallest towns. And it was explained to me, the reason for the bars isn't that there are any more drinkers here than anywhere else, but you have to have a separate bar for the Italians and the Germans and the Cornish, or they will fight.
They probably would.
They had their churches, but they also had their bars. And
right, exactly.
Well, we had all the ethnic Catholic churches, and literally they would be a block away from each other. One of the Italian, literally a block up from the Irish, and then the Lithuanians, maybe 4 blocks over from that, and not that big a town really. So so with the bars, I mean, there really was a lot of drinking in Amsterdam, and it was heavy. One of a woman I know moved up from Brooklyn, okay, and with her husband, who was an attorney, and very, very devout family, a very devout woman. I think she had nine children. And she's looking in the phone book for Catholic organizations, and she sees St. Michael's Association in the phone book and calls up and wants to know how she can join. And the voice on the other end says, "Lady, this is a bar." So the religion and the drinking were very, very heavy. And of course, the little picture in the back of the book cover is a picture of me behind the bar, where I like to say I didn't grow up above the bar. I grew up in the bar. And I think that's proof positive of that. And you got to, when you do, you get to meet, adults, you get to meet a different age group doing that. One of the ways we are segregated in today's society is by age. All the old folks move down to Florida or to their special residential condo development, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
It's
And
a tough
do the
one.
younger folks of today get to learn the wisdom or even how to behave around the older generations now?
That's
Or do
right.
they get to live in, at one point I was living in a 4-unit house, and my mother and father and I was upstairs in front, my mother's uncle, aunt, and uncle downstairs, my grandmother in the back. So yeah, and then I got to college, and they said, well, there's we only have the nuclear family in this country. We don't have the extended family. It's like, oh, really? Really?
Right.
Who wrote this textbook?
Right. I just came from a non, right? What do you mean is we don't have one? Yeah, that's exactly right.
I also have to comment, there's a disproportionate number of older people. I hit the 80 group this year. They still give me free skiing, but Yoopers are proud of being tough. And we have a disproportionate number of elders who do not leave because they're and they're paying with the reputation. So, and my father, who worked for the Michigan government in the Lower Peninsula, was an insurance agent for them who covered the most dangerous occupations that private insurance companies wouldn't do. So the state took it over. And the 3 most dangerous were forestry, mining, and commercial fishing. So guess where his territory was? He was coming to the UP back and forth. So to me, from your discussion, and I hadn't thought of it that way, and I don't know how many places in the country are like that, but we really are proud, and I don't fit in any of these categories, really. I'm a newbie, but
But the other people there, all
in our countries, are proud to identify with certain ethnic groups and ethnic backgrounds, I think.
Oh, yes. There's still some holdouts, but there's also that mixture, that melting pot thing. And one of the reasons why I think Poles are sort of a invisible minority or ethnic group, however you want to call it, aside from the fact that a bunch of us have changed our names, okay, to make it easier for everybody concerned, so you can't spot the name, is that intermarriage, I found out from my research, was very early on going on with the Polish community, even though very, very tight knit in some ways, and even in my own family, my father's 3 sisters married a Lamalfa, a Hallenbeck, and a Jones. And now that's going back away. So yes. So if you let us alone and don't jangle up the nerves about all our differences, yes, we can get along.
Right. One of my great uncles, an Italian who was still hung around the West Virginia, married a Protestant woman and had to change his name from an Italian to a non-looking Italian because he was being confronted by various anti-intermarriage groups, and they had to move to a different town in order, so they weren't going to stay in potential danger. But as David, you were saying, that was happening, and it was not except for the people you would expect, was not prohibited, that were not attacked, in that way. But speaking of these various groups, so we have a couple more minutes. I would be a remiss not to ask you about the one super famous, aside from yourself, native of Amsterdam, and how you came across that information.
Oh, well, that's Isur Danilovich, and that's Kirk Douglas, who it's not a question of coming across the fact that Kirk Douglas was from our town. It's that it was osmosis. It was in the air. Everyone knew it. a very combative individual regarding Amsterdam.
Huh.
And if you take a look at his memoirs, they're not quite as warm and fuzzy as mine.
Right.
But his father was a ragman who lived down on the east end of town, which was the real melting pot and,
Yeah.
and a rough neighborhood. Okay. And the father, as I said, was a ragman. I've got home movies of my father took of a ragman in a horse-drawn cart going past our house when I was a lad. So these things kept going on. But Kirk Douglas's father was more combative than him. I think he would fight physically at the drop of a hat. Very powerful man and all that. But Douglas comes out of that environment and is smart as a whip, I guess, from the get-go, winning, oratorical scholarships and all sorts of things in town, and excelling in what else, drama, and then going on to St. Lawrence University and New York City and such. But he was a tough guy in terms of memories of Amsterdam. And just before I became alderman in the 80s, they had a celebration of Amsterdam, and they brought him back for a parade. And the local story is that he and the mayor got into a real argument in the middle of the parade.
Nice.
Which I won't take sides on that one.
Right. No, that's fine. That's fine.
And
And then
one ethnic group you didn't mention were the native people. And the Upper Peninsula, they were pushed off, although there's still a significant population here, and intermarriage goes on, and a lot of respect. But they were not treated well. Like the West, treaties were made and then violated throughout the UP. Was that an issue at all in Amsterdam?
Well, there are no being back east, out east, our Indian experience was a lot earlier. And also that was a great place to learn history, because you had the Dutch, the English, and the French empires clashing all the time, usually in league one way or another with the Indians, i.e. the French and Indian War. So I live outside Schenectady now, and there was a big massacre of the Dutch people back then. I also haven't mentioned the Dutch people. Why haven't I mentioned the Dutch people living in Amsterdam? Because there weren't that many, really. They in fact named the town Amsterdam after the Dutch had kind of left, if they were ever there in any great force. But in terms of the Indians, what the story, the main story was this: outside of town to this day is a place called Orisville, and the Shrine of the North American Martyrs. And the French sent over some priests and religious brothers to minister to the people on the Mohawk River, and they were not treated well. They were not welcomed with open arms. In fact, Father Isaac Jogues was tortured. That's why it's called the Shrine of the North American Martyrs. And his story is quite remarkable, because he is tortured so badly that the Indians chew off part of his fingers, and he goes back to France, and he receives an indult, a permission from the Pope to say mass with some of his fingers missing, which had not been allowed previously. And instead of saying, well, thank you, Holy Father, and I'll just spend the rest of my days here in France, he went back to again try to convert the Native Americans, and he was killed. He was massacred. He was just butchered there in a ravine. And it's quite a story, and it's one of the stories that everyone in the neighborhood or the river valley knows.
So I think I'm gonna, let's see what time it is. So I think I have time for one more question before Cecilia gets her minute or two. And so the one thing I wanted to ask you, David, without burdening you too much, is that has this book, separate and apart, or does this book suddenly represent an illustration of your own, I don't want to call it ideology or something like that, but because I read this book and I say to myself, well, this is where a lot of my own conservatism comes from. I mean, not from Amsterdam, obviously, but revering these things and understanding the history of where you were to where you're going, and to realize that those need to be respected. That's mine is not a political ideology. Mine is a other way of looking at the world, and is generally called conservatism, although it depends what you're talking about. Does this book fit into your own sort of thinking through, or is this just a result of how you came to where you were?
I think it tells you where I came from. There's certainly more of me in this book than all the other historical books. But one thing we haven't talked about here as to what the great influence was religion, and the influence of the Roman Catholic Church in pre-Vatican II days back then, when there were so many parishes, so many priests, so many people believing, and which is not the case since, where COVID notwithstanding, churches are empty, vocations are down, and what folks believe as part of their religion, even if they are showing up on sporadically on every other Sunday, it was far more firmly rooted then, and that is the great influence in my life. But the whole idea of a more traditional family and looking backward at society, and revering the past, that's one reason why I'm a historian.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Because I am so fascinated by it, and I see the value in what transpired before us and me, and I'm grateful for it.
Right. Yeah, you and I think, are very much on similar pages on that. Well, thank you very much, and that was so fun. And unless anyone has any questions, Cecilia, I'll let you jump in for the question of telling people about the Russell Kirk Center and
Sure.
the audience.
Can you hear me okay, Gerald?
Yes.
Okay, good. I think most of you are probably already readers of the University Bookman, but if you're not, I just want to let you know we do post every weekend. So either reviews or essays every weekend. You can check Sunday morning, and you can read that instead of the New York Times as your afternoon reading if you like. I like to consider it the alternative. So we do our part to put out all kinds of books there that will be of interest to people who are conservatively inclined, although the books themselves are not necessarily conservative. So we'll pick out certain kinds of things that you would be looking for, that you would want to know about, and bring those to you. Independent writers, independent reviewers. And I should also mention as well that we forget to mention sometimes that it is free of charge and free of ads. So you can feel very, you can easily share that with your friends and relatives without feeling guilty about sending them things with ads and subscriptions and all that sort of thing. So I just want to point that out, that if you don't go there already, to go ahead and go to the Bookman. You can just go directly to the Kirk Center website, but you can also sign up to receive it in your inbox as well. The other thing I just want to mention briefly is a little bit about the Russell Kirk Center's other programs. Long-standing seminars for graduate students and undergraduate students. And we've also now expanded to do occasionally ones for other people as well, because we're finding sometimes that people who are not students wanted to come, and that was a little limiting. So we're trying to expand it a little bit more so we can also open it up to people who are not students. But I know as we speak right now, there's a group arriving of about 20 students in Mecosta for a weekend seminar studying Plutarch's Lives and Shakespeare's tragedies with two of their professors. And some other things that we hold is for fellows, our Wilbur Fellows program. I know one of our Wilbur Fellows, Camillo, is on the conference, is on our webinar right now. And so thank you, Camillo, for being here with us. And he's studying Rosa Kirk's fiction, actually, and writing on that for his doctoral dissertation. And the fellows come and live and work there at the Kirk Center for several months in a small community of writers. And so that's some of the things that the Kirk Center does. I'd also like to mention we have a lot of resources available on the website. One of the new things we've done is put together a lot of my dad's classic essays. We call it Classic Kirk. And I would like to mention, some of you may know that today is Flannery O'Connor's birthday. And in honor of Flannery O'Connor's birthday, we posted today, we posted a memoir that my dad wrote. And Flannery O'Connor, you may know, Gerald, that she referred to my dad as looking like Humpty Dumpty, intact. As you know, my dad was a little portly and such. So my dad wrote a memoir about their meeting and was called Memoirs of Humpty Dumpty, and about his meeting that he had with Flannery O'Connor and his writing about her fiction. So Isabel is going to post that for us in the chat, I believe, so you can go directly and take a read on that one.
Yep.
As well as our monthly essay, yes, as well as our monthly essay, which is called The American Mission. And that one's kind of more timely about a more timely issue for us is, does America have a mission? And my dad draws upon Orestes Bronson to go through and say, if it does, how it is about combining the tension of order and freedom, combining those in a healthy, just order. So if you want to go take a look at those, I think Isabel is going to put those in the chat for us. And feel free to email us at info@kirkcenter.org if you have any questions. And oh, I want to mention too, you will be among the first then to hear, we have a new program coming up for the Kirk Center. It's going to be called Pillars, and it's based on my dad's book, The Roots of American Order. That book was a very important book before in about 1974, right before the bicentennial of the US Constitution. I hope I have that right. David would know. And actually, it was Ronald Reagan was actually going to be doing some of the, was involved in getting that going as possibly doing a movie out of it. And Charlton Heston was going to be the reader for it. But that part never came to fruition. But the book itself did come to fruition, and is and it goes back through the 5 cities that have contributed to the foundation of America: Jerusalem, Athens, Rome, London, Philadelphia. And we're going to be taking that and making several projects based on that. And it's, in a way, we can avoid the whole situation of picking certain dates like 1619 or 1620 or 1776 and all those kind of date debates, and go back and say, okay, where did America get some of its ideas from in the political, religious, social, cultural achievements? Where did it draw upon? And that's what this is going to do. And our first program is going to be coming up this summer. It's going to be for high school teachers. It's going to be high school teachers. We're going to be holding it at Holland, Michigan. And it's going to be a high school teacher spending about 4 or 5 days talking with professors, going through the book, and taking certain topics from that and pulling that out so that they can understand it better for their own use in their own classes, and going from there. But anyway, I just want to let you all know that. So if you are a high school teacher or you know one who will be interested, feel free to give us an email, and we will put them on the invitation list. And I think that covers it. Thanks, Gerald.
Great. Thank you. Thank you again, David, and thank you everyone for coming. It's nice to see you all. We will probably be posting this on the Kirk Center website. I will let everyone know, so you can either watch it again, which would be great, or to let your friends know who couldn't make it tonight that they can watch it on the site.
If I could comment on Russell and my dad's relationship, Annette and I, Cecilia's mom and I, often comment. My dad was a very strong liberal and Russell was not. And they could have conversation after conversation. And I was young at the time, and I could sit in and listen to these guys and learn so much about politics. And there was never any that I could pick up tension in the air. They really got along. They admired one another. They learned from one another. And now a lot of my dad's books are in the library there, right, Cecilia?
Oh, that's great. That's great.
Yeah. So, but I value that friendship, and and all the publications she's talking about. And I think I have every one of Russell's books. Lots
That's
of them
great.
with autographs too.
Oh, that's great. That's great.
Real sweet. Thank you. I
You
learned.
betcha.
from that.
So glad for you to join us.
Thank you.
All right, everyone, be well.
Thank you. Good show.
Thank you. Thanks again, David.